It all began with a letter. In August 1939, Albert Einstein, freshly escaped from Nazi Germany, signed a message to U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The actual text was written by physicist Leo Szilard, but Einstein's name was the magnet that got it noticed. The letter warned that Germany might be developing a new type of bomb of unprecedented power, and urged the U.S. to begin its own research. This sparked the Manhattan Project, one of the most expensive and secretive scientific military operations in history. Over 130,000 people were recruited, and $2 billion were spent, more than $25 billion in today's money. Entire secret cities were built, like Los Alamos in New Mexico, where scientists worked in total isolation. The idea was deceptively simple. Splitting atoms of uranium or plutonium releases an immense amount of energy. If you trigger a chain reaction, you get an explosion more powerful than any conventional bomb, theoretically known since the 1930s, practically achieved in 1945. Even more alarming, this button is active, not mothballed, not dismantled after the Cold War. Right now, it's in full combat readiness. In the U.S., Russia, China, the U.K., France, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and perhaps Israel, though it remains silent, like that uncle who always brings a mysterious suitcase to parties but never shows what's inside. This isn't just a weapon. It's a doctrine, a symbol, a guarantee, a threat, and a very expensive insurance policy with a clause that reads, "In case Earth ceases to exist, we'll refund your money." So why did humanity agree to live with a bomb in the room? How did we try to control the uncontrollable? Who broke their promises? And why today are we hearing more and more that we may be closer to nuclear war than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis? If you enjoy slow, deep dives into big global topics, make sure to subscribe to our channel. And in the comments, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. We love seeing how far our stories travel. The button that can destroy the world is real, and it doesn't look like in the movies. It's not red, it doesn't flash, and it's not hidden under a glass cover in a room labeled "Do Not Press." In truth, this button is more of a metaphor. It's scattered across capital cities, underground bunkers, and diplomatic briefcases. It lives in the suitcase carried by a presidential aide. It resides in the mind of a general who believes it's better to strike first than to be late to his own funeral. Imagine this. 6 people on Earth, only 6, have direct authority to launch nuclear weapons. Their bad mood, a sudden stroke, or betrayal by someone close could cost the planet its existence. This isn't a Christopher Nolan movie. This is daily reality. On August 6th, the U.S. dropped the Little Boy bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki. 2 attacks that killed around 200,000 people and became symbols not just of victory, but of horror. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," quoted Robert Oppenheimer after the first test. A haunting line from the Bhagavad Gita that became the moral shadow of the nuclear era. But that was only the beginning. In 1949, the Soviet Union conducted its first successful nuclear test. Washington was stunned. They had hoped to maintain a monopoly for decades. Thus began the nuclear arms race, where each side wasn't just building bombs, but aiming for more, bigger, and faster delivery systems. 1952, the United Kingdom joins the club. 1960, France. 1964, China. The nuclear five emerged, unofficially dictating the rules of the new game. This era birthed some of the most paradoxical doctrines in modern history: mutually assured destruction, MAD, the idea that if both sides can obliterate each other, neither will fire first. Balance of terror, peace through the shared fear of annihilation. For the first time, peace wasn't built on treaties or morals, but on universal fear. Nuclear weapons became not just part of military arsenals, they became an ethical abyss. The U.S. conducted over 700 tests between 1945 and 1992. The USSR, over 900, including the 1961 Tsar Bomba, the largest explosion ever created by humans, 58 megatons. The results? Radioactive fallout, genetic mutations, health disasters among local populations. The cost of proving strength. This era also saw the rise of anti-nuclear movements, the first test ban treaties, and an increasingly loud question: can this power ever truly be controlled? Picture this: two heavily armed rivals in a locked room, fingers on triggers, with 7 billion hostages behind them. That was the global security stage in the 1960s. After a decade of building bigger and better bombs, the superpowers realized something chilling. If no rules were set, the muscle flexing could end in mutual obliteration. The first treaties were born not out of idealism, but sheer dread. Diplomacy, fueled by fear. After the monstrous Tsar Bomba, the USSR, USA, and UK finally sat down to talk. The result, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, PTBT. It prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, but allowed them underground. Why this compromise? Because atmospheric tests were already causing global fallout. Even kids in Kansas had strontium-90 in their baby teeth. Underground? Less visible, less noisy, fewer protests. Far from perfect, this was still a landmark step. For the first time, nuclear states formally agreed. Something has to be done. This is the cornerstone of modern nuclear policy. Its logic was blunt. Countries with nuclear weapons before 1967, the nuclear five, could keep them, but were forbidden from sharing. Everyone else had to promise never to build them in exchange for access to peaceful nuclear technology. All parties pledged to work toward eventual total disarmament. Someday, somehow, in the future. On paper, elegant. In practice, imbalanced. The five kept their weapons. The rest had to trust that this is temporary. Still, over 190 countries signed. It became the legal backbone of global nuclear control. In the 1970s and 1980s, Washington and Moscow realized that every new missile made survival less likely. Thus began a series of high-stakes talks. SALT I, 1972, capped the number of strategic launchers. SALT II, 1979, aimed to limit warhead quantities, though never ratified. START I, 1991, the first real reductions. Each side agreed to cut strategic weapons to 6,000 warheads. These treaties were the first scissors applied to absurdly oversized nuclear stockpiles, not for love of peace, but because of cost. Maintaining thousands of warheads is astronomically expensive. Stability. The more weapons, the higher the risk of accidents, miscalculations, or internal chaos. Public pressure. Anti-nuclear movement surged across Europe, the U.S., and Japan. But the biggest motivator? Mutual fear. If we don't contain proliferation, every future tyrant might get their own suitcase nuke. In 1962, the world came 2 steps from World War III. The USSR placed missiles in Cuba. The U.S. responded with a naval blockade. Tensions peaked. Radars lit up with unknown objects. Generals requested launch permissions. Only a secret compromise, removing Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for U.S. missiles from Turkey, diffused the bomb. Let's rewind to 1959. Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba after a revolution. By 1961, the U.S. attempts the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion, a fiasco that embarrasses Washington and leaves Cuba clinging to Moscow for survival. The Cold War wasn't just about ideology, it was about geography and missiles. For Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, placing nuclear weapons in Cuba was a geopolitical 3-in-1, restoring nuclear parity, as the U.S. had missiles in Turkey and Italy, protecting a newfound socialist ally from American invasion. Psychological advantage. As Khrushchev later wrote, Kennedy looked intellectual, but not tough. In May 1962, the Soviets launched Operation Anadir, a massive covert transfer of nuclear-capable weapons, troops, and engineers to Cuba. Over 43,000 soldiers, surface-to-air missile systems, and 162 nuclear warheads were deployed under the guise of agricultural equipment and sports goods. This was the Cold War equivalent of smuggling a lion into your neighbor's garden and hoping he wouldn't notice. Despite Soviet efforts at deception, U.S. U-2 spy planes captured undeniable photographic evidence on October 15, 1962, missile sites under construction. This wasn't just suspicion, it was proof. President Kennedy was immediately briefed. The revelation turned into a strategic and moral earthquake. Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm. Tensions were electric. Some, like General Curtis LeMay, urged a direct military strike followed by invasion. Others, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, pushed for a naval blockade and diplomacy. The compromise, a quarantine, a blockade without the legal declaration of war. On October 22nd, Kennedy publicly addressed the nation. The U.S. would block Soviet ships from reaching Cuba and demanded the removal of existing missiles. The speech sent shivers down spines. For many, it sounded like a prelude to World War III. At the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted his Soviet counterpart with the evidence, forcing a public denial or a public lie. Soviet ships turned back. The crisis escalated, but neither side blinked. Yet, October 27, 1962, known as Black Saturday, was the closest the world has ever come to full-scale nuclear war. A U.S. U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Pilot Major Rudolph Anderson was killed. At sea, U.S. destroyers dropped depth charges on Soviet submarine B-59, unaware it carried a nuclear torpedo. Its captain ordered launch, but was stopped by one man, Vasily Arkhipov. His refusal likely saved the world. Meanwhile, in Washington, ExComm was shaken. The logic of deterrence had reached its limit. Accidents were happening. Time was running out. Khrushchev sent Kennedy 2 messages. The first, relatively conciliatory, proposed removing missiles if the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba. The second, tougher, demanded the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. Kennedy publicly responded only to the first letter, ignoring the second. Behind closed doors, however, Robert Kennedy secretly met Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. They struck a deal. The USSR would withdraw its missiles. The U.S. would quietly remove its missiles from Turkey within 6 months. And crucially, America pledged never to invade Cuba again. The crisis proved that nuclear deterrence could barely hold under pressure. What averted disaster wasn't technology. It was human judgment, diplomacy, and, frankly, luck. Political consequences. Khrushchev, though saving face publicly, lost credibility at home. He was ousted in 1964. Kennedy emerged stronger, perceived as calm and firm under fire, but privately shaken. Systemic shifts. The Washington-Moscow hotline was established. Nuclear arms control gained momentum. The Partial Test Ban Treaty, 1963, soon followed. The Cuban Missile Crisis reminds us nuclear strategy isn't just doctrine and hardware. It's fallible humans, broken radios, tired commanders, and last-minute decisions. It's the edge of reason and the roulette of history. By the 1960s, the world stood at a dangerous crossroads. The Cuban Missile Crisis had revealed just how fragile nuclear peace really was. Everyone understood. Without clear rules, the next escalation could mean total annihilation. But how do you set rules in a world where not all players are equal? The answer was paradoxical: to create a system that legitimized some and prohibited others. That's how the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPA, was born, signed in 1968 and entering into force in 1970. The NPT is built on 3 core pillars. First, non-proliferation. Countries without nuclear weapons agree not to acquire or develop them. Second, disarmament. Nuclear-armed states pledge to pursue negotiations toward eventual elimination someday. Third, peaceful use. All signatories have the right to develop nuclear energy for civilian purposes under international oversight. It looked like a balanced framework, but the fine print revealed deeper tensions. The treaty recognizes as nuclear weapon states only those who tested weapons before January 1st, 1967. That meant just 5 countries were officially allowed to possess them: the United States, the Soviet Union, now Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China. This group, dubbed the Nuclear Five, became the only legal keepers of the bomb. Everyone else, legally bound to remain non-nuclear, whether they liked it or not. This created a fundamental problem: inequality. The treaty drew a sharp line between those who could wield the ultimate weapon and those who must rely on trust, and sometimes hypocrisy. Many nations accepted this structure out of pragmatism. Others, like India and Israel, refused to join altogether, viewing the NPT as a tool for maintaining nuclear apartheid. To enforce compliance, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, became the watchdog. It inspects facilities, monitors uranium supplies, and assesses whether programs are truly civilian. It has no army, but its reports can trigger sanctions, political isolation, and even war. Over time, another challenge emerged: the so-called nuclear threshold states. These countries don't have weapons, but possess the technology to build them quickly. Japan, Germany, Brazil, and Iran are often cited as examples. Their status is both legal and precarious, like owning every part of a bomb but not assembling it. When the treaty's original 25-year term ended in 1995, the world faced a tough decision: renew or let it expire. In the end, the NPT was extended indefinitely, but many developing countries expressed frustration, arguing that the nuclear powers were not upholding their disarmament promises. Alongside the NPT, other agreements tried to strengthen global norms. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, sought to ban all nuclear explosions, but it still hasn't entered into force. Nuclear weapon-free zones were established in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Hopeful initiatives, but limited in scope without the big powers fully on board. The NPT remains the cornerstone of global nuclear order. But it is also a symbol of an uncomfortable truth, that peace in our world often depends not on fairness, but on managing inequality. In every system of rules, there are outliers: those who never joined, those who broke away, and those who pretend the rules don't apply to them. In nuclear politics, there are 4 such countries. Each has carved its own path, its own logic, and its own risks. What unites them? None of them are part of the official Nuclear Five, and yet all possess nuclear weapons. India has always viewed the NPT as an unfair treaty. As Prime Minister Indira Gandhi once put it, "We will not let others decide who has the right to possess weapons and who doesn't." In 1974, India conducted its first nuclear test, the so-called Smiling Buddha. Officially, it was a peaceful nuclear explosion, but in reality, it was a clear signal of intent. In 1998, India carried out a series of underground tests, formally declaring itself a nuclear state. It never signed the NPT and doesn't intend to. Today, India possesses an estimated 160 warheads, deliverable by both aircraft and ballistic missiles. Its motivations are largely regional: deterrence against China and Pakistan, and the desire to be seen as a global power. In response, Pakistan developed its own nuclear program. Following India's 1998 tests, Pakistan conducted its own and officially joined the nuclear club. Its program was built in secret, often skirting international norms. A key figure was physicist Abdul Qadir Khan, who created a clandestine network that shared nuclear technology. Pakistan is widely believed to have assisted North Korea, Iran, and Libya in acquiring sensitive capabilities. Pakistan's doctrine is more aggressive than India's. It allows for the first use of nuclear weapons in the event of a conventional conflict. This makes the Indian subcontinent one of the most volatile regions in the world, where nuclear war isn't just a theory. Then there's Israel, the silent member of the club. It has never confirmed nor denied having nuclear weapons, but experts estimate it holds between 80 and 200 warheads. Israel's program began in the 1950s with French assistance. In 1986, nuclear technician Mordecai Vanunu leaked details to the British press. He was later kidnapped in Rome and imprisoned in Israel. Israel's strategy is one of deliberate ambiguity. It maintains the bomb without advertising it, a tactic that preserves regional deterrence while avoiding international backlash. North Korea is the most dramatic case. It is the only country to have signed the NPT and then withdrawn, which it did in 2003. The trigger was the U.S. invasion of Iraq and fears that Pyongyang might be next. In 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. Since then, it has tested at least 6 more times. Its current arsenal is estimated at 30 to 60 warheads. What makes North Korea especially dangerous is the lack of oversight and the erratic nature of its leadership. Kim Jong-un isn't playing chess, he's playing Russian roulette, and the world is watching nervously. These four countries are more than just exceptions. They challenge the very idea of non-proliferation. Some argue that if the rules don't apply to everyone, maybe it's time to change the game. Others see these cases as warnings, proof that the system is fragile and that it could all come crashing down if just one player decides to go all in. How do you know if someone is building a bomb in their basement, especially if they don't want to be found? That's the job of the international control system, to detect, deter, and delay. But without nuclear police or access to every secret bunker, the system works more like a puzzle, one where the pieces are scattered, obscured, or deliberately hidden. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, founded in 1957, is the main institutional eye and ear of this system. It has two key roles. First, verifying that nuclear programs labeled peaceful remain so. Second, building trust through transparency. The IAEA conducts hundreds of inspections each year, weighing fuel, sealing centrifuges, monitoring lab work. If a country allows access, it's a sign of cooperation. But the agency cannot force its way into facilities. It can only go where it's invited, or where treaties permit. That's where other tools come in. In the 21st century, nuclear intelligence often begins in orbit. Commercial satellites capture construction sites, thermal signatures, and unusual traffic. These images helped expose secret facilities in Iran, like Natanz and Fordow, a suspected nuclear reactor in Syria, and new missile silos in China. To that, we add intercepted communications, internet traffic analysis, and economic data, such as uranium imports or reactor component purchases. In other cases, the crucial evidence comes from people, not pixels. In 1986, Israeli technician Mordecai Vanunu leaked the details of his country's nuclear arsenal to the press. In 2004, Pakistani scientist Abdul Qadir Khan admitted to running a black market network for nuclear technology. In 2018, Israeli operatives stole an entire archive of Iran's nuclear documents from a warehouse in Tehran. These cloak and dagger stories sound like thrillers, and sometimes they are, but they often provide the clearest insight into opaque programs. There's also the tool of diplomacy. When suspicions rise, the typical sequence is investigation, international condemnation, economic sanctions, and sometimes negotiation. The 2015 Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, followed this path. In such cases, nations agreed to limit or freeze parts of their programs in exchange for sanctions relief or political recognition. But the system has its limits. It depends on political will. A country that refuses inspections, like North Korea, is nearly untouchable. Even compliant nations can develop dual-use technology, machines for peaceful energy that could be redirected to weapons. And there is always the time lag. Detection often happens late. By the time the world reacts, the materials may already be enriched, the warhead designed, the silo prepared. The global control regime is real. It works. But it's not a steel cage. It's more like a spider's web, intricate, fragile, and constantly threatened by the weight of ambition. In the 1990s, it seemed like the nuclear age was winding down. Strategic arms reductions, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a wave of post-Cold War optimism gave the illusion that missile silos might soon become relics. But the 21st century has proven otherwise. Nuclear weapons never disappeared, they evolved. During the Cold War, nuclear logic was binary. If you strike, we strike back. Everyone loses. This was the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD. Today, doctrines are less rigid. They've become flexible. Some countries, notably Russia, have introduced the idea of limited nuclear use in the event of a perceived existential threat. But what counts as an existential threat? Civil unrest? A cyber attack? Defeat in a conventional war? The ambiguity opens the door to nuclear blackmail. Not just deterrence, but a strategic hint. Push too hard, and there will be consequences. At the same time, the weapons themselves are changing. It's no longer about megatons, it's about precision, speed, and stealth. Hypersonic missiles now travel at extraordinary speeds and can maneuver unpredictably. Low-yield warheads are designed for tactical use, not city destruction, but battlefield impact. Unmanned platforms can potentially deliver a nuclear strike with minimal detection. These developments shift the logic of deterrence. A nuclear strike no longer implies a devastated metropolis. It could mean a surgical warning, a military base, an airport, a single flash on the horizon. Another under-discussed threat is cyber vulnerability. Most nuclear platforms rely on digital infrastructure. What if it gets hacked? A cyber attack on a command system or an early warning radar could create chaos. The 2010 Stuxnet virus showed that complex systems can be infiltrated. One can now trigger a nuclear crisis, or the illusion of one, without launching a missile. The purpose of nuclear weapons has also shifted. Once, they were tools of victory, then tools of peace. Now, they are often instruments of domestic politics. In North Korea, nukes legitimize the regime. In Russia, they symbolize global status. Elsewhere, they reinforce national prestige. The bomb is not just a weapon, it's a message, sometimes aimed inward. Ironically, the more options states develop, the less stable the world becomes. During the Cold War, there were 2 players. Now, there are at least 9. Back then, nuclear war meant global apocalypse. Today, localized escalation is a real possibility. Then it was about bunkers and buttons. Today, it's cyber sabotage, tactical warheads, and information warfare. In the 2020s, nuclear doctrine is less about survival and more about power projection. It's about posture, prestige, and strategic signaling. And increasingly, it's no longer a source of stability, but a source of tension. After 1991, it seemed the world had stepped out of the nuclear tunnel. The Soviet Union had collapsed, arsenals were shrinking, and diplomacy had taken the lead over missiles. But today, more analysts, diplomats, and military experts, not just doomsayers, are saying the same thing. We're back on the brink. The 2020s have ushered in a period of global destabilization. The United States is no longer the unchallenged hegemon. China is rising. Russia is seeking to revise the global order. Iran and North Korea are growing bolder. The international rules of the game are no longer clear or agreed upon. In this environment, nuclear weapons are no longer just the last resort. They've become part of the strategy, not just deterrence, but a tool of diplomacy, pressure, and messaging. From 2022 to 2024, Russian leaders repeatedly made public references to nuclear weapons in the context of their war in Ukraine and rising tensions with NATO. This broke a long-standing taboo. Once, nuclear rhetoric stayed behind closed doors. Today, it's part of press conferences, headlines, even election campaigns. That's dangerous. If nuclear blackmail works, it will be repeated. If it doesn't, there may be a temptation to prove it wasn't just a bluff. More nuclear players mean more risk. During the Cold War, two actors could establish a balance. Today, with at least 9 nuclear states and potentially more in the wings, the system is more chaotic. A crisis between India and Pakistan, a new flare-up on the Korean Peninsula, or an escalation between Israel and Iran, all are local conflicts with global nuclear implications. The more flashpoints exist, the greater the chance that somewhere, someone under pressure will decide to act. And the paradox of deterrence remains: the more complex the system, the more ways it can fail. Deterrence only works when all players are rational, cautious, and connected. But today's world is flooded with disinformation, hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, and unpredictable politics. Even rational systems can collapse under pressure. Then there's the human factor: emotion, error, fear. One misstep, one misread radar, one unauthorized decision, and the logic of deterrence becomes irrelevant. Meanwhile, the architecture that sustained nuclear stability is crumbling. The U.S. and Russia have exited the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty. The START agreement is under strain. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, still hasn't entered into force. That means fewer formal constraints, less verification, less trust. We're not on the verge of a full-scale nuclear war in the traditional sense, but we are in a period where the likelihood of mistakes, miscalculations, or provocations is steadily increasing. This isn't alarmism. It's a sober assessment of a system built on fear, one that's losing its structure and clarity. Nuclear weapons are the great paradox of our time. They exist, yet no one wants to use them. They destroy everything, yet are seen as guardians of stability. They are the greatest threat and the insurance policy. Like a company that promises to compensate you in the event of the world's end. We live in a reality where the possibility of humanity's total destruction isn't science fiction. It's a policy tool. And that raises an ethical, cultural, even philosophical question. How did we come to accept that survival depends on managing fear? Nuclear weapons forced humanity to look at itself from the outside. For the first time in history, we gained power over ourselves. Literally, not fate, not gods, not nature, but us. We can end history with the press of a button. That's not just a technological milestone, it's a test of maturity. So far we've passed. The Cold War ended without a nuclear exchange. Thousands of warheads still rest in silos, not in the sky. But doctrine has not become morality. We haven't rejected the bomb. We've just become better at hiding it. We haven't solved the problem, we've frozen it. The nuclear age isn't only about missiles, generals, and diplomats. It's about human nature, about how well we can control our fears, ambitions, egos, and paranoia, about how long we can live next to danger without triggering it. It's a constant test, and every new generation must pass it again. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the nuclear era is not how to avoid war, but how to understand ourselves. because the bomb is a mirror. In it, we see our values, our fears, our willingness to compromise or to collapse. Maybe one day nuclear weapons will disappear, but not before we grow up enough to no longer need them. If you found this journey through history and geopolitics as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe for more in-depth, slow-burn stories that unpack the world with nuance and curiosity. And don't forget to let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? See you in the next episode.